you. All right, so now we are recording and I am going to share my screen, which has a PowerPoint presentation for today. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us on part 2 of the THP commenting series brought to you by Stop Clearcutting California. My name is Tom Wheeler. I am the Executive Director of the Environmental Protection Information Center. And I am also an attorney. I review, track, and write comments on timber harvest plans. I don't necessarily consider myself an expert. I feel like there's probably only 1 or 2 experts in this field anymore, and they are largely retired. But I know quite a bit, and I'm hoping to share what I know with you here tonight. So why we're here, I think that all of us are interested in commenting on timber harvest plans or somehow affecting private timber operations, whether it's a THP in our backyard or we're concerned about the climate crisis and we want to do something about it. And we think that forest management is an important way that we can address the climate crisis. We're all interested in timber harvest plans. So last week's discussion, as I said at the very beginning, there is a recording of last week's show. I haven't gotten it up onto YouTube yet. That will hopefully come in the next week. We are just slammed as always over at Epic. And so it'll get up when it gets up, and I will make sure that Perry and Karen have the link and they will be able to send it to you. And they will use the email that you registered for this tonight. So last week we talked nuts and bolts about THPs, timber harvest plans. So how to find them, where to access them, the contents, and just basic strategy on commenting on THP. Tonight we're going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about how CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, interrelates to the Forest Practice Act and rules, and how principles of CEQA can be latched onto THPs. We're also going to talk about the Clean Water Act, which is implemented in California through the Porter Cologne Act. We're also going to talk about the Endangered Species Acts. So we have both a federal and state act. And I think that these are really exciting topics, and this is kind of the advanced course. So again, if you're looking for the refresher, go back to the YouTube video from last week's class when it is available. So CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. Epic, one of our first most fundamental cases was Epic v. Johnson, and it confirmed this principle of the forest practice rules, which is CEQA and its substantive criteria for the evaluation of a proposed project's environmental impacts apply to the timber harvesting industry and are deemed part of the Forest Practice Act and the forestry rules. So what does this mean? We talked last class about how a timber harvest plan is functionally equivalent to an environmental impact report. So instead of trying to make people go through 2 hurdles, having to produce a THP and having to do an EIR, the state said, well, the environmental analysis component is similar or could be made similar. The opportunities for public comment and for review by other resource agencies are similar, or could be made similar. So we are going to say that we're going to simplify it and make it so that you only have to do this one thing, this THP. So the forest practice rules have largely fleshed out how timber harvest plans can act as that functionally equivalent document, but they're not complete, the forest practice rules. There is a large body of CEQA case law in particular that I think that we can be able to bring over from the CEQA world into the forest practice rules world. And this is, I think, an exciting area for us to work as a forest defense movement to try to develop, is bringing these ideas, this well-developed case law, into the forest practice rules. So if we're only going to rely on the forest practice rules, you know, I don't know if that's enough, but we have opportunities to do more. And Alan points out in the chat that the timber harvest, the THP process is a certified regulatory program, which is approved by the Resources Agency. That is how we are, that is how a THP is a functionally equivalent document. So what does CEQA bring to the conversation here? So a couple of CEQA concepts that I think can help inform your THP comments. We're going to go through these 2 pages of these concepts. So first is the idea of a baseline. And this is something that I think I see lots of errors in timber harvest plans. So the baseline is effectively, if the project were not to occur, what would the conditions on the ground look like in the future? So it is our counterfactual against which the alternatives can be measured. So for example, if we are talking about sediment pollution as a result of a THP, the baseline would be conceivably, if we didn't log, if we didn't do any of the road improvements or road creation as a result of this timber harvest plan, what does the sediment production look like from these lands in the condition that they are currently in? So if there is no project going forward, and as I've said, I think that this is an area that THPs often do a pretty bad job, is that they don't lay out what is this counterfactual world where this project doesn't occur. So the THP might talk about how the sediment as a result of the project is not considerable. But again, if it's going to do good analysis, then it needs to actually describe what are the conditions and what would they be absent this THP. So, you know, oh, well, we're going to punch in some roads and we're going to water bar the roads, and the roads are going to be built to the highest standards, the best management practices. If they're not considering the impact of those roads, the addition of those roads relative to an unroaded state, then that is some sort of an error that needs to be fixed in their analysis. So something else that is potentially tempting, and this is something that I see a lot of attention in the SQL world, but not in the THP world, is the alternatives analysis. And I think that we can kind of understand why the alternatives analysis doesn't particularly work very well here. So THPs are required to consider alternatives as an environmental impact report would be required to consider. But fundamentally, alternatives have to be able to meet kind of the purpose and need. You know, why are we going forward and doing this project? And so if it's a private landowner and they are asking for, or they want to harvest in a particular way, they can kind of define the world in such a way that they don't really need to analyze very many alternatives. I think that there are certain situations, however, where alternatives analysis could come into play. In particular, if we are talking about state-owned land or land that is subject to some other sort of encumbrance, or if they're in these situations, the purpose and need of the THP, the kind of fundamental reason why we're doing this THP is different. You know, we're not as subject to the whims of a private landowner. Now we get to pull in kind of the rest of, or we can pull in other considerations. So alternatives analysis, a big thing in the SQL world, probably pretty difficult in this THP world, but just wanted to flag. And I want to get to another example on baselines. So before tonight's class, Perry and I were talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a THP comment that I am working to develop right now. I feel like how almost all THPs consider greenhouse gas emissions as a result of a timber harvest plan are structurally flawed in this way. So the analysis typically talks about the emissions associated with the potential logging, so running chainsaws and heavy machinery and hauling wood to a mill. These are the emissions that are directly attributable to this THP. What they don't do, however, is they fail to consider that absent this THP, we would have a forest still standing, right? Especially in the clear cut example. And so something that is missing from the analysis, it's apparent that is missing when we consider the baseline, is the loss of greenhouse gas storage that would otherwise exist in that forest. So we are shortcutting sequestration, right? So when you cut a forest down, there's going to be some period of no sequestration. You're also taking a potentially mature forest and removing it so it has a loss of sequestration. You're also losing all of that storage. So I think that there is some sort of a baseline problem here. They're not accurately describing the existing conditions in most greenhouse gas emissions analysis. So this is, as I said, an area that I want to I want to address further. So Alan asks a question about alternatives analysis, which is a good one. Are the types and methods of operations alternatives that must be considered? Yes, functionally, yes, right? So alternatives analysis could look like, something where you have multiple scaled analyses or multiple alternatives that kind of propose, 100 acres of clear cutting and 50 acres of clear cutting and 20 acres of clear cutting, no clear cutting, right? Like that could be the range of alternatives that somebody would potentially consider. Alternatively, you could propose as a potential alternative for analysis something that would accomplish the same goal, but would functionally reduce impacts. And maybe this is some way that alternatives analysis could be a more fruitful issue, which is, the type of yarding. So if you're trying to figure out how to get it from the place where it was felled to some sort of a timber deck, if we are talking about the impact of like a ground-based skidder yarding, that's going to be more impactful than if you're talking about some sort of partial suspension skyline yarding. These are maybe new terms for you. So one is effectively sending heavy machinery on the ground and dragging a tree. The other is having a tree partially suspended and just dragging a little bit of that tree on the ground. So one's going to have considerably larger impacts. Alan, I think that you could have a good alternatives argument, provided that that you can make an argument that this is a reasonable way to achieve the same function of the THP. I think that alternatives analysis is going to be hard there, though. All right, some more CEQA concepts. Significant effects. So this is really where a lot of rubber hits the road. So the cumulative effects analysis of section 4 of a THP is primarily all looking for whether or not something is going to produce significant effects. So CAL FIRE has not fundamentally defined what a significant effect is. because it's difficult. They give some examples in the forest practice rules in technical rule addendum number 2 of things that could potentially create or could constitute a significant effect. So, you know, if it's a salmon bearing stream, if you have a significant temperature increase, you know, that could be a significant effect. And I think that that's something that is highlighted by the forest practice rules as a potentially significant effect. In other contexts in CEQA, the lead agency that is doing the environmental impact analysis, they've clearly defined significant thresholds of significance. So if you produce X pounds of you know, CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, then you've crossed a threshold for this type of project. The Board of Forestry has not done that for the forest practice rules. And so oftentimes the significance analysis is somewhat weak. So significance as defined is any substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in any of the physical conditions of the area affected by the project. So there is a whole list of things called out here. This is an incomplete list also. You can imagine a scenario where there could be significant effects to a resource value that is not included in this list. So for example, the forest practice rules have THPs consider impacts to recreation. Recreation is not on this list from CEQA. There can always be other areas of potential impacts that were never considered that if it would produce a significant adverse change, a substantial adverse change, that would be a significant effect for the purposes of cumulative impacts analysis. Something else that is important in all of this is, given that there are no thresholds of significance for most measures in a timber harvest plan, most of the analysis is qualitative. So instead of you know, predicting the total number of, or the total square yards of sediment that could be produced and delivered into a stream as a result of timber harvesting, oftentimes you'll have squishier analysis. So, well, timber harvesting has the potential for these types of impacts, but we are going to apply these general mitigation measures, and we believe that as a result, you know, there are not going to be significant impacts. I think that this is an area for us to potentially strike. If you have poorly considered what significance might mean in a THP in section 4, you can both enlarge the categories or the type of way that you think about the categories of significance, right? Like, so these different resource areas, to include things that were not considered by the THP. You can also undermine their qualitative analysis through some of your own quantitative analysis. And technically, quantitative and qualitative analysis is held in a somewhat equal footing. But I think practically, before a judge recognizes that they're not the same. And so, so if you were to bring forward, explicit ways that, you know, an explicit amount of peak flow increase, for example, then you can start to undermine their qualitative peak flow analysis. So Chris asks, if you find a weakness in the THP, how do you find success in court? i.e., is it the luck of what judge you get? If not, is it the skill of your attorney to make an attractive case to a judge? So in everything, CAL FIRE is going to get deference for their opinions, meaning that what CAL FIRE says is going to be afforded some degree of, sorry, Heather, your questions I again skipped intentionally. There's going to be some measure of just trusting what the agency says, and there are reasons for this. So I think that generally what you have to do is you have to get outside of the standard playbook. So if anybody's a fan of chess, you know that if you're playing some sort of a computer in chess, one way that you can often beat computers is you get outside of the book. So you get outside of the area where a computer is able to predict based on previous games how it's going to go. So you get into unknown territory for a computer, and so it can't rely on predictive models, or it can't in the same way. I think similarly, we have some benefit in trying to get outside the book for CAL FIRE. So there are certain issues that CAL FIRE has become really good at addressing because they get these questions a lot in THP comments, and they're able to come up with a strong response in their response to comments, and they're able to explain away your potential issue to the point that a judge is going to have to agree with them. I think that one thing that we can do as a potential strategy is looking for ways to get outside the book. So finding new resource categories to consider, or finding new science to bring forward, or conceptualizing our arguments in different ways, or grabbing cases from the SQL world and attempting to shoehorn them in. All of these, I think, are strategies for us to achieve some degree of success. But generally, to be successful, you have to have a well-established administrative record. So you have to submit good comments for a judge to eventually find out with you, and you have to put them together in a way that is understandable for a judge. A bit of your success in litigation is going to be the luck of the draw with who you get, and that's because judges are humans and they bring in their individual biases to any case. Something else, yeah. So that's kind of the obvious. One thing that I think is also helpful is you'll have to bring your case initially in the superior court in which the THP is located. So in the state court in which the THP is located, I think that you can sometimes plan that the state court is going, or the local court is going to be more sympathetic to the politics on the ground, or the local community politics. So they're not going to want to do something that would materially harm the large timber company that is so important to their region. Often on appeal, I think that you get a more unbiased panel and a higher caliber of judge. So if you're bringing a complex case, just because you lose at the superior court level doesn't mean that you're going to lose generally. All right, let me make sure I got all of these questions as they go. Alan asks, how do they get by saying that the impact is short term and not significant? The duration of a potential impact is one thing that affects the significance, right? So if you're going to have a long-term impact, but it's not really necessarily that bad, maybe that is kind of on par with a short-term impact that's pretty bad, right? So there's not any strict defined rule. If you have a short-term impact, that is just terrible, right? So if you were to design a THP so that it was next to an elementary school, and the THP was supposed to operate when the school was in session and just be blaring the chainsaws, that is a potentially significant impact. And even if it's just a couple months, if that THP is scheduled to go on, while kids are taking their SAT classes or whatever it is, that is, the duration of the impact is not necessarily important. It's duration plus intensity is how we get towards significance. All right. Randy asks, in regional forestry practices be tied to the broader global crisis of habitat destruction and species loss? Probably not. I mean, although we are seeing an extinction event, we are living through an extinction event right now, on par with, an asteroid hitting the planet. If the individual conditions on the ground in the analysis area are not dire, then it's not going to be significant. So significance is not exclusively, but it is largely tied to the area of of um, of consideration that you're doing the sort of impacts analysis. So like in the THP area and slightly broader, that's probably going to be their area of analysis. I forget the precise term that the forest practice rules uses, but at some point we have to define a geographic scope for our analysis. And so different resource categories have different geologic scopes within which we consider potential significant cumulative impacts. So Heather asks, what percent of THPs are for the middle of a forest versus someone's private acre? I don't particularly know. I believe that the majority of timber production is coming from major industrial landowners, as opposed to the small forest landowners. The small forest landowners are often those folks that are trotted out by the Board of Forestry or others in an attempt to make a more sympathetic face for the timber industry. But I generally think that most timber production is being done on private industrial forest land. So Green Diamond, Humboldt Redwood Company, Mendocino Redwood Company, Lime Timber Company, Sierra Pacific Industries, all of those folks. Those are the ones that are really doing the big timber production. So Alan says small landowners are a significant source. There you go. I know the Board of Forestry puts forward information every year about this sort of stuff, and I think that they track that metric. A question of mine, this comes from Chris, a question of mine from the last workshop was how a legal challenge can bring in CEQA law, not necessarily including the functionally equivalent slash or the forest practice rules regulations. So there are areas that the forest practice rules have created implementing regulations to be a functionally equivalent document to an EIR. So there is a section in the forest practice rules that deals explicitly with alternatives. So its description of alternatives analysis is going to be different, but slightly similar or substantially similar to CEQA's requirements. Ultimately, they have to fulfill the same substantive requirement. If there are areas that are poorly defined, such as this is perhaps how I'll move on to the next bit of this presentation, which is other concepts. So piecemealing. This is something that is perhaps familiar to you from environmental impact analyses. If you break up a single project into multiple smaller projects, this is something that is done to piecemeal project. If you break it up into smaller bits, then each of those smaller bits is going to have an individually smaller impact. Cumulatively, if you are able to do a good look at that picture, your analysis should still be the same because you're considering all of these projects together. But this is a way that that people have tried to get around doing good impacts analysis is you just break up into smaller chunks, and then it becomes easier to hide kind of the larger problems with a big project. Something that the forest practice rules has not well defined is how to deal with this on a THP basis. So, for example, I know the Stop Clear Cutting California group was interested in this issue for some THPs in Shasta County, I believe, last year. So there were two THPs that were submitted at the same time that were right next to each other, or very, very similar to each other. So, the THPs had to consider the other's impact in their cumulative impacts analysis, but they functionally broke it up into two smaller chunks. So that could be an area that we could bring in CEQA concepts to a whole different world of CEQA law into THP analysis. That is one potential. There's another potential. So let's get back to alternatives analysis. So as I said, the forest practice rules have a section on how to do alternatives analysis. There may be case law that exists that has better defined what alternatives analysis means and what are the kind of how it should substantively work, right? Like, so in the end of alternatives analysis, we're going to be able through this process to have this kind of complete look at what are the other ways to achieve the same goals and reduce potential impacts and whatever. There might be some good language that we could just steal from a CEQA case and bring over to the forest practice rules area. It will require a little bit of good lawyering, but any good lawyer should be able to figure out how to apply CEQA law to this. It's just like how if you are bringing a case under, or if the state were to bring a case under the State Endangered Species Act, you might want to reference, if you're a state attorney, federal cases, because oftentimes federal law has, we have these little mini laws, and oftentimes the federal law will have a much better developed case law. And so you can use that as persuasive argument. It might not necessarily be controlling, but it is at least persuasive. Chris asks if you're going to bring in CEQA case law, is there a legal path to introduce this into the THP challenge? Chris, I think that the best idea would be to include it as part of your comments. I would certainly want to raise any sort of CEQA, some sort of connection in my comments. Again, there is a requirement that we exhaust, that we provide to the state, to CAL FIRE, to the RPF, functionally everything that we think is wrong with our THP. We need to, we can't be hiding issues. You can't litigate on something that you don't bring before. And Alan says, read the OR. They must respond accurately. All right, I'm going to move on. There's a lot of comments, and I feel like we just keep getting distracted, and let's see, we're going to run out of time if we don't move forward. So Alan is, as I said, a lot better versed on Port of Cologne than I am. So Alan, if you ever want to chime in, please be my guest. So the Federal Clean Water Act applies to both point source and non-point source pollution. So point source, that's kind of like your perfect example of pollution. That's the stock image that the local news uses when they're describing pollution. That is green gunk falling out of a pipe into a river next to a beach, right? Like that's it. Point sources are those things that have discrete, identifiable entry points for how the pollution gets into the broader environment. Makes sense. Forestry related pollution is almost always going to be non-point source pollution. So this is for more distributed forms of pollution. So, if you were to have runoff from a field or from a forest, that's how there's not a discrete point where it is entering let's say a river, that's going to be non-point source pollution. And so they're treated differently. In California, we have um, some of the best non-point source regulations in the country. The Clean Water Act is an example of what we call cooperative federalism. So the Clean Water Act says that here is this goal that we have. States, we're going to give you the authority to figure out how to implement this goal that we have. And the idea with cooperative federalism is that what might work for California might not work for West Virginia, and that in each state and trying to figure out how to get to this clean water standard might figure out new and unique ways to do it. The laboratories of democracy, state law. California, the Porter Cologne Act is great for non-point source pollution, or better, I should say, than almost every other state. So non-point source pollution is regulated by the Porter Cologne Act fundamentally through waste discharge requirements or waivers of waste discharge requirements. Alan, I'm not sure if you would agree with me or not, but I feel like they're pretty similar, with the exception that waivers are time limited. So they can only exist for 5 years before being re-upped, whereas WDRs can go forward forever. So before you pollute, you have to have a WDR permit from your local regional water quality control board. So here in Eureka, California, I am regulated by the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. If I were to go out to Shasta County, I think that that's the Central Regional Water Quality Control Board. Each regional board has their own flavor and has their own regulatory scheme that is largely governed by the State Water Quality Control Board.
Yeah, as far as WDRs and the waivers go, the other 9 or the other 8 regional boards outside the Region 1 area, which we are in, they follow the lead of Region 1. So their WDRs are very similar. But I like to, we do have the Porter Cologne thing, and the WDRs are actually implementing programs for water quality control, for water quality control plans. And there are certain requirements for water quality control plans. You have to show under such a plan how you are going to attain, if you have an impaired water body, which they all are in our region, you have to show how you are going to attain water quality standards. If your water body is impaired, you have exceeded the standards and you are not meeting the combination of beneficial uses and water quality objectives contained in the basin plan. And the basin plan is the overall water quality control plan for the region. So WDRs rely on language in the basin plan, and there's non-point source language in the basin plan. And there's also, basically the language says that all potential sources will be controlled. Then, but if you go back to the Forest Practice Act and the duties of the director may not approve a plan that is inconsistent with the applicable water quality control plan or basin plan. So if there's a problem there, then the director has to say no to the approval of the THP. So I point to 2 areas of challenging the issue of pollutant inputs.
Yeah, so as Alan was saying, the regional board gets kind of 2 bites at the apple here. One, through the forest practice rules, if the regional water board were to find that something is not going to, it would result in, Alan, help me out with the language here.
If you have a controllable discharge, which is anything that is potentially available for being delivered to surface waters, they have to deal with it. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
Um, and well, so most THPs are going to be, or most THPs in my region, Region 1, are covered by this order, this 2004 order. And this is a WDR order. The order assumes that THPs are going to not result in any sort of meaningful pollution to the environment or or failure to attain water quality standards. Um, it's a little bit of horseshit in my view, but the regional board feels a deep uneasiness in what they call regulating forestry, right? So there's an agency that's charged with the regulation of forestry. The regional water board really tries to avoid doing much that will get into forestry, except for the potential of 303D listed waters. So
Or
if
any pollution that's coming from forestry needs to be regulated.
it needs to be, but I would submit that the regional water boards aren't terribly excited about their regulatory authority.
Right, more so in 303D water.
More so in 303D. So 303D are those waters that are doing bad, right? So these are not currently meeting their water quality objectives for some reason. You know, in some water bodies, it might be copper. You know, maybe there was an old copper mine that has a tailing pile that leaks into the river, and it is, you know, the water doesn't meet their water quality standards for that reason. Along the north coast, where I think a lot of us are located, sediment is a big problem. I think I've seen it said before that the majority of water bodies on the north coast are 303D listed for sediment pollution. There are some
Everyone except Smith River.
Randy, herbicides, I believe, do count as a pollutant, and they are regulated by the order, just as a heads up. And Heather points out TMDL is a calculation. All right, so this gets into the next bit. So if you have a 303D listed water, then the water board has to figure out how much water or how much of a pollutant that water body can accept without impairing its use. So if you are managing for cold water refugia for salmon, then you might have a 303D listing for temperature if it is impaired for temperature. So I'm thinking perhaps of, you know, the Scott River, which is often too warm because of a lack of shade for salmon. So the water board is going to come up with a total maximum daily load. So the amount of pollution that can be put into the river without impairing its water quality. And it's going to come up with a TMDL implementation plan. Let me say that the Regional Water Quality Control Board, or at least the North Coast one, is woefully behind in completing their TMDL implementation plans. So these are how we are going to get to a point where these waters are no longer going to be listed. It is a plan to recover a water body functionally. And where we do have TMDL implementation plans, you may have separate WDR requirements. So as Alan and I have said, in these areas, the regional board has been more helpful and has taken a more robust view of its charge to protect water quality. So for the Elk River in Humboldt County, which is just south of Eureka, which was really just hammered by industrial logging in the 1990s, they will limit the total amount that can be harvested a year. This is not something that they do elsewhere. They have Other restrictions, including increased buffer zones of where timber harvest is limited. So these can be areas, and developing and pushing the regional water board to develop these TMDL implementation plans and specific WDRs to implement the implementation plans.
Yeah, those are owner specific or land based area specific WDRs. I want to point out the difference. TMDLs point to reductions that need to be achieved to attain water quality standards, but the method for attaining that is a WDR or a waiver.
Yes.
And the regional board, and those are water quality control plans. But if you look in the basin plan on the non-point source language, it says all sources that can be controlled will be controlled. Doesn't have to be impaired or not, you know, that's what it says. But they're not doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As Alan has said, you will find specific WDRs for sometimes you'll find them for water bodies. So you know, it might be for the Garcia or something like that. You might also see them specifically for individual timber companies. Sometimes individual timber companies will get their own WDR for parts of their operations. So Green Diamond has one for road construction. WDRs are just another vehicle. If you're really going down the rabbit hole and you want to go beyond THPs, that I think it could be useful for some additional work.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that these implementing programs are actually stand-ins for TMDL action plans or implementation plans. The Garcia River is the only river on the North Coast. Well, Stemple Creek might have an action plan that has a prescriptive action plan. And in some cases, the general WDR is stricter. So whichever is the strictest prescription gets applied. But I just want to add that the response in the Garcia River has been incredibly good. We've gotten very good observable changes in the landscape as far as trees and canopy cover, and our spawning gravels are like pristine, and we have fish popping out all over the place, where in the early 80s and 90s they were gone except for steelies, but they've been finding coho and even chinook and pink salmon. So there was a big fight over the TMDLs, and they came up with this WDR thing, and Mike Lazo was part of it, along with Joe Brescher, and I think Linda Sheehan was in there too. Getting Senator Alper to bring a bill out sunsetting the old WDRs. So now they're using new WDRs, which is fine with me if they are enforceable and doing the job, which they aren't. They need to be upgraded.
So Chris asks, is it not that the WDR program just an interim program before a TMDL is implemented? So generally, I would say that the general WDR is is a bit of an interim program before a TMDL and a watershed specific or some sort of an ownership specific WDR is implemented. But that's not necessarily true that the WDR program generally is an interim program. WDRs are the fundamental vehicle of Port of Cologne. All right, so
as a water quality control implementing program.
So let's move on to the Federal Endangered Species Act. And this is your way to get out of state court if you had the facts and you wanted to. The core components of the ESA are here. I am going to focus on 4. So Section 4, Section 9, Section 10, and Section 11 of the acts. So just as a brief reminder of civics lessons that we've probably forgotten, when a law is passed, it's often passed in different sections like this. So when the law was passed, the Endangered Species Act was passed, the listings area of the law, how to list a species, was in section 4 of the thing that passed. And then it is then later codified at a part of the United States Code, the USC. So this is at 16 USC section 1533, section 4. So if you want to be cool and impress all of your friends, the pro thing to do is to refer to the different sections as the law was passed, at least for the Endangered Species Act. So you'll hear about a Section 9 take case, or in a federal context, you might hear about Section 7 consultation. That's how you can be cool. That's my pro tip for you on being cool. All right, so listing. Listing is incredibly difficult and time consuming. And I would suggest that if you are facing an imminent threat from a timber harvest plan, you're probably not going to be thinking about listing. But if you are a group that is focused on a particular area and there is a wildlife resource that you care a lot about that is unique to your area, then listing might be something that you would be interested in pursuing. So in theory, anyone can petition the agencies, or the agencies can act in their own accord to list a species. I have asterisks next to areas to point out the reality of the situation versus as written. So that's as written. Anyone can petition or the agency can act. In truth, really only groups like EPIC or the Center for Biological Diversity will petition to list species. There was once a time when the agency would do things on its own accord at the very beginning of the ESA. They are not doing that now. It's too politically controversial. There was a time where states would petition to list species. Again, that's probably not going to happen again in my lifetime. So really the functional job of listing species is on us. And you can list as either threatened or endangered. Threatened species are things that are likely going to go extinct or have the potential to go extinct maybe in 100 years, and endangered as a rule of thumb is about 50 years. So if something is endangered, it is in a much more imminent threat of extinction than a threatened species. And endangered species get higher protections within the act. So the decision whether or not to list it has to be made only on the best available science. They can't bring in economic considerations or other non-science things. And the factors, the considerations for whether or not to list a species are explicitly called out. Past, present, or reasonably anticipated future habitat modification, overutilization, disease or predation, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. So for example, if there was already something on the ground that was supposed to protect this thing and it was not doing its job, that would be an example of that. Or other natural man-made factors affecting its continued existence. That is our catch-all in case the threat doesn't fall under the other categories. So at the time of listing, the law anticipates that the service, either the Fish and Wildlife Service for terrestrial species or freshwater fish, or the National Marine Fisheries Service for anadromous fish and other marine life, they're going to designate critical habitat and they're going to come up with a recovery plan. Typically now, you have to sue to get a critical habitat designation. You have to sue to get a recovery plan. They will often not do both of those things that they're directed to do at the outset. So again, a lot of the burden for implementing the law falls onto enviro groups. So as a quick example of one of our listing petitions, EPIC had tried for 20 years and were ultimately successful to list, or successful in part, to list the Pacific fisher. So this is that cute guy. It's in the mustelid family, the weasel family. It is about the size of a house cat. It is a ferocious predator and is even capable of taking out Porcupines. It's one of the few things that can hunt porcupines. Here is its range. In green is the extant range, the part that is still around today. The salmon color is its historic range, so where it once roamed, and the periwinkle, whatever that kind of purpley color is reintroduced populations. So we have two extant populations, one in Northern California, Southern Oregon, and one in the Southern Sierras. The threats, in addition to, well, I'll do this one first. Toxicant exposure, so trespass marijuana grows are often associated with with toxicants, so herbicides, pesticides of other stripes, chemical fertilizers, things of that nature. And we know from experience that these toxicants kill wildlife. On the right is a picture of former Humboldt County Sheriff Mike Downey with a dead fisher that was found at a trespass grow site. What is the impact of getting a species listed? Asked Karen. You have to get a species listed to be able to enjoy the protections of the ESA, and we'll get to the biggest protection and the biggest use that we can have as excited environmental activists in just a sec. Another threat is predation. So in particular for the fisher and for the martin and for other small mustelids, is that when we affect their forest habitat, we can increase their predators. So clear cuts are wonderful habitat for generalist predators like bobcats or coyotes. And these critters feed on fishers and martins. And so if we increase clear cutting, we are going to increase likely bobcat presence, and likely we're going to increase predation for our at-risk friends. So as I said, we originally filed in a listing petition in 2000. It took us at least 3 lawsuits and 20 years. Ultimately, the Southern Sierra population of fisher was listed, but the Northern California population was not. As much as I'd like to challenge it, I don't know if we have the grounds to do that, and we're still trying to find a public interest attorney to help us bring a challenge so that hopefully all fishers within their former range would enjoy the same protections under the Act. Now, only the one distinct population segment in the Southern Sierras gets that protection. And this is the teeth. These are the Section 9 take prohibition is where the ESA earned its reputation as the most impactful of our federal environmental laws. So the law reads, except as provided in sections 1535 and 1539 of this title, it is unlawful for any person subject to the jurisdiction of the United States to take any species within the United States or the territorial sea of the United States. So I have in different colors 2 different parts of this, except as provided, so the exceptions portion, and the definition of take. Let's first look at the definition of take. So take is defined under the Act in the definition section as harm, harass, pursue, wound, or hunt, shoot, wound, trap, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such behavior. The term harm was then defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service in the same way, and it is defined as this. Means an act which actually kills or injures wildlife and includes significant habitat modification or degradation where it actually kills or injures wildlife by significantly impairing essential behavioral patterns, including breeding, feeding, or sheltering. This is really, really important. So the ESA can prohibit private actors from doing things to endangered species that impair essential behavioral patterns. So if you have a northern spotted owl and you reduce the amount of northern spotted owl through a timber harvest plan to the point where you're going to reduce its likelihood to reproduce, for example, even just in 1 year, that is a take that is prohibited under the act. Um, some some other area of future legal development, which I think is going to be big for us, is subsection G of this section 1538, which is this: it is unlawful for any person subject to the jurisdiction of the United States to attempt to commit, solicit another to commit, or cause to be committed any offense defined in this section. So there is a theory of the Endangered Species Act, which is poorly defined, that suggests that if there are laws that would result in the taking of a species, those laws are violative of the act. So this is a potential area for litigation against the Board of Forestry. If the Board of Forestry promulgates a rule that allows for a taking to be committed, there's a potential that we could get after it under this section. As I said, it's a very poorly defined area of the law. This section of the law has only a handful of cases that have considered it, but this is an area of strategic growth, perhaps is what we can call it. So as I said before, the exceptions provision. You're allowed to take endangered species under certain circumstances, one of which is through an incidental take permit issued through section 1539 of the Act. And this is going to be, you've probably heard the term habitat conservation plan. That's what this section provides for us, is for habitat conservation plans. So the law here says that the Secretary of the Interior or of Commerce may permit any taking otherwise prohibited by section 9 of the Act, if such taking is incidental to and not the purpose of carrying out an otherwise lawful activity. So if you're a timber company and your actions may result in taking, you can get a permit to allow you to do that. So the rules for such a permit, this is a habitat conservation plan. This is what will ultimately get you an ITP, an incidental take permit, is the development of a habitat conservation plan. The taking has to be incidental, so you can't directly or intentionally go out and do something with the purpose of killing or wounding or hunting, whatever, all those words and the definition of take. You can't intentionally do it. It has to be incidental to your otherwise lawful activity of harvesting timber. You have to minimize and mitigate the impacts of such taking to the maximum extent practicable. That's kind of a fuzzy area of the law. You have to ensure adequate funding will exist to implement all those mitigation and minimization measures. And the taking will not appreciably reduce the likelihood of the survival or recovery of the species in the wild. So habitat conservation plans are something that generally only large landowners get to enjoy. So Sierra Pacific Industries is attempting to get a habitat conservation plan, actually has one passed and approved under the Trump administration, and we think it's shit, and we're going to sue them over that someday. Green Diamond Resource Company has them. Humboldt Redwood, Mendocino Redwood Company has them. These are the big boys, right? If you're going up against a smaller timber harvester, a smaller landowner, it's likely that they don't have one of these. So our friends over at the Friends of the Guala River are actually doing a Section 9 take case right now against proposed logging under a THP. So the citizen supervision in section 11, that's how you actually bring a take case. So something that a lot of non-lawyers don't understand is that just because something breaks a law doesn't mean that we can necessarily file a lawsuit to try to stop it. Only where we've been given permission by the government to enforce the law can private individuals bring a case. So, for example, somebody might oh, well, example, I don't even have to use a hypothetical. In the Endangered Species Act, I'm not allowed to go after somebody who I know previously killed, let's say, a northern spotted owl. I can only go after them to stop a reasonably foreseeable and imminent violation of the law. I can't go after past violations. And I get this power through the citizen supervision. The citizen supervision is great. Um, in addition to allowing us to enforce the law, which is not a guarantee, it also allows us explicitly to recover fees, and the fee shifting provisions of the ESA are more friendly to our attorneys than the general fee shifting provisions of the Equal Access to Justice Act under the federal law. So if there is the potential, if you can make a good case that something might violate the ESA, it might result in a taking, um, then you might be able to get somebody from Earth Justice to represent you. You might get a good attorney to represent you for free, which is really, really difficult in THP litigation. You know, we're generally looking at $270 an hour otherwise. The fee shifting provision of the ESA is wonderful. And a Section 9 take case is not easy, but it is kind of a clearer vehicle sometimes. You know, you need to just show that something is reasonably foreseeable and you win. Before you bring an ESA lawsuit, you have to provide notice to the potential violators of the law. So you have to give them an opportunity to cure and correct their otherwise unlawful activities by giving them a notice of intent to sue. So basically you're telling them, knock it the hell off, or else I'll see you in court in 60 days. So this is a mandatory obligation under the law. And if you don't do this, you will not have your case heard in federal court. We also have a mini ESA here in California. Unfortunately, it is not as good as the federal act. So for one, there is no citizen supervision. So if someone is going to violate the California Endangered Species Act, I am wholly reliant on the state of California for enforcing the law. I can't bring it sua sponte on my own. The definition of take under the California Endangered Species Act is more narrowly defined and does not include the words harm and harass, but does include all of those other terms that the federal act does. And so it has been interpreted as lacking the authority to regulate habitat modification that results in the impairment of essential behavioral patterns, but that impairment does not rise to the point of actual death. So the California Endangered Species Act would apply if I were to fall a tree on a northern spotted owl. It would not apply if I was to impair their breeding. So you can see why for us, the California Endangered Species Act is not great. The good thing about the California Endangered Species Act is that it is easier to get things listed under the law. It is a much faster timeline and is less politically controversial, although it is still controversial. And people don't really understand the law terribly well. So I found that you can often blur the distinction between the two and use the specter of the California Endangered Species Act as a pretty useful threat. So as an example of the fundamental power of the Endangered Species Act, I believe that this is where the environmental community has had the greatest luck in trying to take on timber harvesting and regulating bad behavior is through the ESA. So my local example is Headwaters Forest, which is a product of the Endangered Species Act. Quickly, Alan asks, do THPs need to disclose state listed species? Yes. Not only do they need to disclose federal and state listed species and the taking of of a species under either act is prohibited, and a director cannot approve a plan that would result in taking. They also have to disclose rare species. So you will have species of special conservation concern, or there are other potential categories that need to be disclosed within that THP. You could also have locally rare species which are abundant elsewhere. So, for example, you might have a million Tule elk, in other part of California, but Tule elk have an extremely rare and constricted range here in wherever I live in California. Impacts to those Tule elk, because they're rare here, that could still be a significant impact that could fall under the cumulative impacts analysis in section 4 of a THP. Great question, Alan. All right, so Headwaters Forest, preserved because of the ESA. This is the marble murrelet. I am sure a lot of you are familiar. It is basically a flying potato. They live in old growth forests along the coast, no more than 50 kilometers from the coast. And they are a really weird species. They are a seabird, but they lay their eggs on mossy deposits on big fat branches in coastal forests. So a forest has to be old enough that the branch is big enough that it will naturally have a large enough space to collect moss that would be big enough for a nest. But then additionally, that it has to be wet enough and moist enough and covered and all those other things that we associate with old growth forests to allow for the marble murrelet to be able to nest. It is one of the more true old growth obligate species. So it really does require big old trees and well-developed large blocks of contiguous old growth forest to have nesting marble murrelets. Chris, great question. I'll get to it in just a sec. All right. So the story is that the Maxam or the Pacific Lumber Company was once kind of a local staple of the community. It was a fairly well-run timber company, and they had a business model that resulted in the retention of more old growth than other companies. They had the strategic business foresight at one point in their operational history to understand that at some point all of their competitors were going to slick off all of the old growth with left in private hands, and that if they were to restrict their amount of cutting in the old growth, that they would have a strategic business advantage over other companies in the future. And old growth redwood is really the good stuff, right? That has the good heartwood that is rot resistant. Young redwood is not a terribly, it's not the superlative wood that the old growth redwood is for a lot of reasons. So it retained a lot of old growth on the landscape. Fast forward to the 1980s, Maxam and Charles Hurwitz bought the Pacific Lumber Company. They realized that the price of the Pacific Lumber Company did not accurately reflect its holdings, and so took it over, and in doing so ran up a lot of debt. And then they needed to start massively increasing logging, and including clear cutting of old growth, in order to pay off the debt to service their debt. So this set up a fight, right? Pretty obvious. We have old growth. We have marble murrelets. Marble murrelets are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. There are murrelets within the Pacific Lumber Company land. Pacific Lumber Company at that time did not have a habitat conservation plan and incidental take permit, so they were subject to the take prohibition. So I say all as if this wasn't a huge monumental effort, and it was. What it took was finding the murrelets, showing that they were likely in this area, and then coming up with expert testimony to say that if you were to log, then you were to take their nesting structure, and that area would no longer be functionally murrelet habitat, and murrelets would be taken as a result. That was what it took. In the case, Marble Murrelet versus Pacific Lumber Company, which I love in part because we brought the case under the name of the Marble Murrelet. It wasn't Epic v. Palco. It was Marble Murrelet v. Palco. We got injunction to stop logging. This was in the, I I believe it was the Owl Creek area of headwaters. Correct me if there's any old guard headwaters defenders here. And through a series of other similar cases, we were able to largely hold up logging within headwaters, which fundamentally forced the company to seek to have a solution, and it forced the state of California and the federal government to come up with a bargaining position as well. And we had the feds and state give an offer to Pacific Lumber Company to purchase their lands. So, but for the Marble Murrelet, but for the Endangered Species Act, we would not have Headwaters Forest. We did not stop them primarily through THP litigation, although there was a significant portion of THP litigation that was used at this time. So
I think it was 375 million bucks for Headwaters.
And when I say we, question from Karen, I mean EPIC, but I also mean the broader Forest Protection Coalition, because the Headwaters movement was a coalitional effort. It was EPIC, it was the Sierra Club, it was small groups that are no longer in existence. Everybody had a role to play in the Headwaters fight, although EPIC was one of the leading litigants of that era.
Yeah, the regional board was really pushing on Palco.
Yeah.
There was a lot of fighting going on.
And that is, I don't think that that's Julia's tent. I think that was a different tree sit. And tree sitters also, so this is this is kind of how everybody worked together to in the Headwaters movement. Tree sitters would often go into an area that was planned for harvest, and they would hold up logging long enough for EPIC and others to run to court and get an injunction to stop logging. So the civil disobedience of Redwood Summer, of the Headwaters movement, was instrumental in achieving legal success and ensuring that these areas were going to still be standing for us to protect in court. And additionally, into raising the stakes and raising the public profile of this fight. You know, when you had the national news coming to Eureka, California, Podunk, Eureka, California, to report on, tree sitters, this was big, so yeah. So, yeah, Alan, what's up?
National listed Coho.
Yeah,
it was all over the place.
Yeah, so coho salmon was another one of the species that was instrumental, and we still have coho, right? And so this is maybe an area that would be easier for folks if you have sediment pollution of if you have salmon pollution, you might have take of coho salmon, which again, coho salmon, even the killing of a single juvenile coho salmon, technically is a violation of the act.
We did a case on that one.
Yeah. Oh yeah, what was the case name?
The guy was Felta Creek. You've heard of that place?
Yeah.
And that's where Borellus was, right upstream from Borellus's. Larry was part of it too, but it was River Watch and Coast Action Group.
Wonderful.
But they admitted take, and they agreed to remedy. It wasn't a big fight, but it was a take suit.
There you go. So today we went through a bunch of stuff. I can quickly scan questions. Here's a good one from Chris. How trustworthy are the efforts by a THP submitter to look for endangered species? How does one get the proper scoping for the idea of endangered species on a THP footprint? That's a $1 million question, Chris. So one, we will have information from other areas that we can bring into our review process to figure out whether or not endangered species are going to be present. So you don't wholly have to submit the trust the THP submitter. One thing you can do is you can look at other THPs that were submitted in that same area and look at the endangered species analysis in those THPs. So if there was an active owl site, for example, in a THP from 2014, and now we're in 2021, and somebody's proposing something within, 0.7 miles or whatever it is nearby, and they don't admit this, then that is one suggestion that there might be endangered species present. There are other databases that you can use. The state of California maintains one, the California Natural Diversity Database, CNDDB. It costs some amount of money to access CNDDB and run a report. You can usually trust that CDFW will do at least that in their review of a THP. There are other databases as well that are product of citizen science. So iNaturalist, eBird, all of these platforms allow individuals to submit their own reporting of species. And so if you're in an area that has a lot of birders, you might get reports of, a potential ESA listed bird. You can also make educated guesses, right? So if you have forests of a sufficient age in, Northwest California, you should probably assume that there might be northern spotted owls. And so then you can look at the THP. They will give you their survey information as part of the THP, and you can compare their surveys to the survey protocols. So you're supposed to do surveys in a particular way to ensure accurate results. They don't do things in a way that that will ensure accurate results. Then you can't. That is a violation, potential violation that could be checked in court or in THP comments. Heather asks about citizen science and water quality and other environmental monitoring. That can be useful as well. So if you are a forest activist and you've kind of decided to adopt a particular area, one thing you can do is you can go out and do first flush reports. So it can be, a very hard science thing where you get a water quality monitor and you can look at the suspended sediment in a water sample after a first flush. So after the first big rain after a while.
For sediment, if you have evidence of changes in elevation, I mean, Jesse did that in Elk River,
Yeah. So absolutely, citizen science can be useful, and it can be hard science and it can be soft science too. Taking photos of a stream that looks like chocolate milk is a fairly good indicator that something's wrong, right? We are not substantially controlling sediment pollution if we have a bunch of sediment pollution. And so what I would do there is I would run that to the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I would ask for an investigation by one of their enforcement agents of existing THPs in the area. Or I could use that as evidence against a future THP in that same region, which is to say, look, past forest practices have not resulted in adequate water quality or with the attainment of water quality standards. Like this is kind of evidence of this. So yes, citizen science works, make sure that you try to do it in some sort of methodical way or some sort of a way that is objective, but absolutely use that data in your THP comments and try to narc on timber companies if you think that they're violating the law. And ask the regional board and CAL FIRE to do enforcement or investigations if you think that there is a potential violation.
Yeah, give them latitude and longitude. You can get that off of Google Maps, so they know where to start looking, and show them a picture. And actually, a lot of pictures can get you a impaired listing.
Yeah.
It doesn't take that much evidence.
Um, so Randy asks a question that's specific to East Shasta County, but I think that this is one that can be a good discussion for the whole group. In East Shasta County, the porcupine seems to have been eradicated. Randy, here in Humboldt County, it's the same thing. Timber companies love to poison porcupines because they can girdle a young tree, and kill it. Would the porcupine be a valid candidate? Maybe. So the Endangered Species Act has a broad definition of the term species. Species includes species, and there's a lot of different ways that you can define species. It also includes subspecies and distinct population segments.
Yeah.
So if the porcupines of East Shasta County were reproductively isolated from other porcupines or exist in some sort of a habitat or environment that is different than, other porcupines of its species or subspecies, that can be sufficient for it to be a DPS. And if you have kind of good evidence that it is not doing well, that could be a case for a species listing. You might have a harder time in trying to get subunits of a larger species listed than if a larger species was doing poorly. But one thing that we are experiencing, and this is something that maybe is a good thing for folks to look up, is we are discovering, as a result of high resolution genetic analysis, that we have a far greater diversity of life than we once thought present. So there are things called cryptic species. So this is where you will have significant genetic divergence that shows that you have two different evolutionary paths, that would be, indicative of different species or speciation, but they look the same. So here in Humboldt County, for example, we once thought that there were two subspecies of flying squirrels. Now we recognize that there are three subspecies of flying squirrels because of a high resolution genetic analysis. So, Randy, I would wholly say, put in the words porcupine and phylogenetic, which I will spell out in the chat. Phylogenetic, or species and cryptic, or porcupine and cryptic species. And maybe there's something there. Chris asks, who's qualified to call for and document owl presence? So the Forest Practice Act and rules have a way that you can become a certified spotted owl expert. And doing that, you can write about owls in a way, or come up with parts of a THP under these forest practice rules that would deviate from norms as a spotted owl expert. That said, I don't believe that you need to have any specific qualifications to hoot for owls. Hooting is often a job that is given to, like, grunts, biotech grunts right after college. You'll graduate from HSU with your wildlife degree, and you'll go work for Timberland Resource Consultants or something like that. And you'll go out and hoot. And that will be your first job in this sort of wildlife timber world. If you were an individual and you were to demonstrate some sort of competence and knowledge of the protocols, you yourself could go out and hoot, although you're limited by your access to land. Yeah. And that brings up the question that Chris then brings up. Without access to the THP area and trespassing, how does one get discovery for the public to know what the baseline conditions are on a THP? That's hard. That's honestly very hard. You can make reasonable inferences based on the surrounding environment if you are able to access it. We are blessed now in this era of having widespread aerial imagery, and you can do a lot using predictive models um, up- that utilize the aerial imagery as a base. So this is kind of crazy, but you can guess forest age, for example, based on what color a pixel is in a Google image, and that's something that was done out of Oregon State University. So if you're good at GIS, you can use GIS, and you can use some of these remote imaging things to do this. There's also just we have the internet now, and there are so many documents that are available, and there are so many historic reports that you can cherry pick. So, for example, if I were to work in an area, I could look up the 303D listing and the TMDL that was published by the North Coast Regional Water Board for that area, and that could drive me to more studies and more studies and more studies. And through asking nicely and through sleuthing on the internet, I can come up with a ton of information, probably more information than you would ever get just by walking through the forest on a particular plot. Can evidentiary observations within the THP be submitted to the record by anonymous? I don't see why not, Larry. One thing that I have seen occur is that you'll often have forest elves, civil disobedience, the earth firsters. They might publish pictures on their Facebook page or on a blog or something like that. Those are certainly open to the public and accessible, and you could use those. In the Mattole, that was certainly something that's been done in THP commenting. I'm not sure to particularly to much benefit, but it is something that is possible. Again, and particularly because this is being recorded, I do not suggest that people trespass.
Drones.
Drones, yeah, drones. You also don't control the airspace, and you're allowed to fly drones. In California, does private land have to be posted if the owner wants to keep people off? Jeff, great question. No idea. No idea if that's required. Larry, your other question about being named for trespassing to get the evidence, I also don't know that. And I see that I'm at 7:35, and I know that my wife is waiting to eat dinner with me, so I will need to go. Karen suggested in a comment in the thread that it would be great if this group could confer on THPs in the future, and I agree there. And I hope that through these THP workshops and through this list of folks who have participated, that we can start to build a larger movement of folks who are interested in contributing on THP review, and we can strategize about areas for focus. Right? It is important that we reform California forest practice rules, and it might be that we want to look for test cases, and we can try to dream up what would be a good vehicle to get something changed. And it might be that we go after an SPI THP that is unconnected to anywhere that we kind of live by or feel particularly drawn to, but it might just be that bad example. So to the extent that we could all labor with our oars in the same direction, the better.
So I want to say something. My history of commenting on plans, I mean, out of the hundreds that I've commented on, maybe 3 were denied completely,
Yeah.
and there are 4 or 5 pieces of litigation in there. However, there were a lot of changes accrued to those comments. if you get your comments in early before the plan is established, and you get people, the agency, the review team to really look at things, and you look like you know what you're talking about, and you bring substantial issues to the table.
Yes, and you know, if there's ever something that is problematic to you and you want changed, it is easier to negotiate changes to a THP than it is to kill it, right? So again, if it's a THP in your backyard and they plan to start operations at 7 a.m. and you like to sleep till 9, maybe that is something that you can negotiate with the RPF. Or if not the RPF, maybe you can negotiate that with the LTO, the licensed timber operator. Not everything requires killing it in court or whatever, right? We are resource limited as a movement. We don't have the expensive lawyers. We don't have the deep pockets, so we have to be strategic. All right. With that, I'm going to end it. I'd like to thank everybody. In particular, thank you to Alan for helping me on with his extensive knowledge. And
I always dreamed of having a crew of people commenting on different plans and just driving Cal Fire crazy.
it would be a lovely thing, wouldn't it? All right, so this will eventually get posted. Karen can send you a link. Karen or Perry will send you a link when it is posted. And I'd like to thank everybody. If there's any questions that you might have, feel free to email me, tom@wildcalifornia.org. If you can't remember that, look me up on the Epic webpage and you'll find my email address. So thanks everyone, and I hope you have a lovely night, and let's change forest practices.
His rates are really good.
See you guys.